Well, hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to that Christian Nerd channel. Thank you so much for joining me for this live stream. This is actually the first NerdVision live stream that I've done in a few months now. I think since October of 2023. So it's good to be back doing these particular kinds of live streams. So in this video, we are going to be talking about science and faith and the universe. And things related to those things, all very big topics, but it will be talked about from my perspective as a theistic evolutionist, but particularly as from my guest's perspective as a old Earth creationist. So that's what we will be talking about in this video. Before we get to that, a couple of announcements. So this month I plan on finalizing and actually getting the third video in the biblical slavery series, talking about what the Mosaic Law is, out. I've been talking about this video for months. I have been doing the research and trying to read stuff. I got notes from my professors because a couple of them helped me out with it. So that was really nice. So that should be coming out this month. I also have a video I'm working on with someone about biblical slavery, and I will be working on a video talking about John MacArthur's recent statements about psychology and mental health. So you can look out for those. One of those, if not both of those, will be on someone else's YouTube channel. So I will keep you guys informed about that. Besides that, check out the links in the description. The link to my guest's Instagram account will be in the description, as well as my link tree where you can find the articles I write. I just published one today about the three-tiered canon that you can check out, and I have a bunch of other things that you can check out as well. Now, with all of that said, let me bring on my guest. Hey, how are you doing today?
Good. How are you?
I'm pretty good, so go ahead and introduce yourself and tell us who you are.
All right. So I'm Maya, and you can find me on Instagram at Chance of Wonder or chanceofwonder.com also. And we have Christian apologetics, a lot of parent centered stuff. And although I do come from an old earth creation perspective, uh, my big thing as an apologist is focusing on people that have thinking perspectives. I myself am a former software engineer for over a decade. And the way I came to Christianity was from having been an atheist for most of my life. And had the evidence not convinced me, I wouldn't have become a Christian. And I wanted my child to understand all of the things that took me years to figure out, because when I talked to Christians, they couldn't answer my questions about creation and the universe and everything else. And to that end, we now have a children's book out called Where Did the Universe Come From?, which just goes through all of the arguments for a creator God in the way that a child as young as 3 can understand. And I can attest to that personally, seeing as I do have a younger child. And this book it's a kid's book because there really isn't a whole lot of apologetics for kids, but it's also got, because I'm kind of a nerd myself, it's got a really big parents section that kind of explains all of the all of the facts and references and things that I wanted to know as somebody considering the Christian perspective. But, of course, there's fun pictures and stuff for the kids. So that's kind of my background and my story and why I'm here.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. That is really cool. So, as per the title of your book, where did the universe come from, and what evidence do we have of that?
So the short answer to that is God made it, not aliens or the multiverse or nothing at all. It's just God. And that sounds like a simplistic answer, but you have to believe in something impossible, right? Because either something came out of nothing, or it's always been here, or there's a cause totally outside of space and time. And since something coming out of nothing for no reason is impossible, even though that's what we're told all the way through school, let's throw that to the side for a second. It's always been here. That was a theory for a long time. And in the middle of the 1900s, Mainstream science decided, nope, there was a cause. It started at some point. So let's put that off to the side. We're left with a cause outside of space and time. And as far as what that cause actually is, well, you could say God is an excuse for it, but there's Occam's razor here, right? There's evidence of design, there's fine tuning, and if it looks designed, it probably was. That's the most simplistic conclusion that we can get from that. And when we look at fine tuning, when we look at the complexity of DNA, when we look at ball and socket joints, and we look at all of these other things, it looks designed, it looks fine tuned. It's more complex than anything that human engineering has ever accomplished, ever could be. And as a former software engineer myself, I can attest to it from that perspective as well. I see things also like the multiverse as a theory, and that really just never made sense to me. It sounds to me like an attempt to deny what is really obvious and right in front of our faces, that it obviously is fine tuned and it obviously is designed. So I think that's something to consider as well.
It was really interesting to me because I was in a apologetics class last semester, and in that class we listened to a TED talk from a scientist who was proposing, I believe, a multiverse theory,
Mm-hmm.
and he was talking about like the numbers and the sort of things that would be needed in order for life to exist and those sorts of things. And I didn't write it off as ridiculous like some of my classmates did. I was just kind of like, this is just kind of more evidence, in my
Right,
opinion. This is kind of more ammo in the fine tuning argument,
right, right.
in my
Yeah,
view.
definitely. And yeah, what you're mentioning reminds me of a conversation that I had with a friend a while back. And we were talking about my friend had actually had a little bit to drink. And so he was talking about things that he normally didn't. And so he starts talking about, yeah, this is so complex and this is so complex. And he's like, and then, it just came from nowhere. And I'm like, are you sure about that? He's like, well, yeah, like the multiverse. And I said, the multiverse? It's like, well, you don't like think there's a God that made that or something. And I'm like, I do actually. So then we started talking about that for a while and it was fun.
That's no, that is funny. So Christians, of course, and even other faiths can agree that God had some involvement in material creation. But Christians in particular disagree about how that works out.
Yeah.
And so that is a big reason why we're here doing this live stream. And so, as you mentioned, and as I mentioned, you are an old earth creationist. So, if you could just tell us, what is old earth creationism?
Old Earth creationism. Okay. So, first off, as an old Earth person, I don't necessarily want to say you have to believe this way. That if you're young Earth or if you're theistic evolution, that's totally cool. We love you and we support you. I want to share my perspective as an old Earth creationism, or as an old Earth creationist, excuse me, uh, because somebody who was in the position I was, a STEM field type person who looks at the evidence and says, you know what, I see from science that the earth is old, but I'm surrounded by people in church who think that I can't be Christian unless I believe in a literal 6-day creation. So, for that reason, I want to go ahead and share my perspective. You don't have to agree with me, but these are the things that really spoke to me becoming a believer. So with that said, as an old earth creationist, I believe that the earth is old, just like science says, and God made it just like the Bible says. And there have to be zero conflicts. Because we see in the Bible, Psalm 19:1, that the heavens declare the glory of God. And this suggests that we should seek answers through science.
I see. So you are going to make the argument that science is a revelation from God in a similar way that the scriptures are.
Absolutely. He's given us his word in the form of the Bible, and he's also given us something to observe. And because the Bible says the heavens declare the glory of God, to me, that says we're supposed to look up at the sky and say, wow, who made that? I need to figure out more. Let me see what else I can find out. And that is supposed to lead us to eventually a belief in God. And I believe that it does.
Gotcha. So, what science did you see that convinced you that the Earth is old?
So, in terms of an old Earth and like versus a young Earth, we can see distant stars that have been around for much longer than the young Earthers say that our universe has existed. We have radiometric dating of rocks from the Earth. We have the moon, we have the asteroids, we have billions of light years distance from many stars, and we can see them. We have the expansion rate of the universe. And if you do the math, it has to be much older again than a few thousand years. We can see, as I said, the observation of distant stars that burnt out millions of years ago. And when we do the math with the speed of light, that just isn't possible if the Earth is only thousands of years old. We have the rate of continental drift. We have hundreds of thousands of years of ice layers in the Arctic. We've got uh, tens of thousands of years of sediment in a lot of lakes. So, a lot of scientific evidence that to me is just incontrovertible. The Earth is old.
And so, some young Earth creationists have proposed the idea that God has made has made the universe look old when the scriptures clearly support a young Earth. I would argue in response to that that this would make God deceptive and
Mm.
unnecessarily so. But I'm curious if you've heard that before and what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, definitely. So, apart from the scientific evidence for an old Earth, the young Earth view presents, in my opinion, some contradictions and doesn't sit well with a lot of the biblical text surrounding creation. We have a lot of issues with the young Earth view when we look at the text. And when we look at it from just, say, the English perspective, when we use the word day as we're accustomed to using it, sure, you can see if you don't look any deeper, 6 days, that's it, no questions. But if we look a little deeper, there has to be more to it. For example, with the first three creation days in the young Earth view, touting a literal evening and morning on days 1 through 3 until before the sun was there. What's making the 24-hour day? Why should I assume that those are 24-hour days when there's no sun by which a 24-hour day is measured? And modern day scientists and apologists aren't the only ones who have questioned this either. You have Philo, Origen, Augustine, and others who also questioned the length of a day, saying, you know what, there must be some wiggle room for the length of a day. And of course, the Hebrew word there isn't day, it's yom. And Hebrew is a much less precise language than English. That word yom has a lot of different meanings, and only one of them is a literal 24-hour day. There are, of course, a lot of other arguments for why the days are long, but that's just one of them.
Gotcha. So you would say that, of course, God did not make the universe look old when it's actually young because the biblical text doesn't support a young earth to begin with.
Exactly. The text does not necessitate that the days have to be 24 hours each, or the yom, in fact. And I'll probably use that term interchangeably with day because that is the Hebrew word from which it's translated. There is yom, which means a time period of some finite length, not an infinite time period, but a finite length. And it may or may not be a 24-hour time period.
So this is actually interesting to me because I see a lot of people go to one of the passages in Psalms or Peter when he says a day is like 1,000 years, and they'll say, "You see, these days in Genesis could possibly be 1,000 years." Now, for me, as someone who really likes hermeneutics and biblical interpretation, I'm saying, well, pause. Why are we going to Peter to figure out what the author of Genesis might have thought a day was? And
Sure.
and so it's interesting that you didn't make that jump. You actually stayed in the text and said, there are reasons like here that would cause us to think differently about these days.
Absolutely. And there are other reasons within Genesis as well. And if you'd like, I can go into a few of them.
Yeah, sure, go ahead.
Okay. So as far as days 1 through 3, we went through the reason why those are questionable as to the length. 24 hours doesn't make sense if there's no sun till day 4, and that of course is the young earth view. But we also have day 6 to look at as well. And if you take a look at everything that transpires on day 6, it must have been really, really, really long, because you have the creation of all creatures and humans, which is Genesis 1:24 through 29, 2 and 7, and 2 7. You've got planting the garden in Eden and making it grow, which is Genesis 2 8 through 9. You've got putting Adam in charge of everything with instructions. So here's how to care for every single plant in the garden. That would have necessarily taken a long time. Adam essentially getting a master class on how to take care of everything. Become a master gardener in what? 5 minutes, an hour, an afternoon? How much of this day gets taken up for just that? And then we have naming all of the animals, Genesis 2:20. Even 1 minute per animal uses too much time for this to be a literal 24-hour day. And you would need to name one every few seconds, remember them all, and move on for this to even fit within a 24-hour day. And then, of course, there's more, because there's the surgery to form woman, Genesis 2:21 through 22. So all of these events crammed into one 24-hour day. I don't know about you, but that is way more than I could ever fit into one of my days.
Mm. Yeah, no, that's understandable. But to play devil's advocate, God is omnipotent. Why couldn't he do it?
He certainly could, but then what you're talking about is a contradiction. Say, why can't he fit more than 24 hours into 24 hours? Well, God isn't illogical. He can do things which are possible. It's like the question, can God make a rock that God can't lift? Well, God isn't a contradiction. God can't be a contradiction because God is truth. And so I wouldn't say that he could make a 24-hour day that isn't a 24-hour day. He certainly could make a day that's longer than 24 hours. But then we're going back to the view that we're looking at the Hebrew word yom, which is a finite time period, arguably one that must necessarily be longer than 24 hours, not just because of days 1 through 3, but because of day 6 and even because of day 7 also.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So you are going to argue though that the events that are recorded in Genesis are historical, which is just as a quick side tangent, is different than asking if it's literal, because literal is about how the information is conveyed. It just means without poetic elements to it, without figures of speech. But when I'm asking if it's historical, I'm asking, were Adam's feet on the ground at one point in time?
Yeah, absolutely. So, as an old earth creationist, I do believe in a literal Genesis. And when taking a careful reading of the Genesis text, I personally find that an old earth view fits the text better than a young earth view. Not only for the reasons that I mentioned, of course, with Yom not necessarily meaning a 24-hour day, and the implications of the text definitely supporting that conclusion. But the word Yom is used as a long but finite time period, not only in Genesis 2:4, but repeatedly throughout the Old Testament, over 60 times, in fact. And there are several early church fathers that I just mentioned that question the length of it. It's not a new concept to question the length of Yom as more than a 24-hour day. This is a very old concept. Um, and as you mentioned, there are supporting verses in the New Testament going towards it. And of course, the days of creation, one of the things that speaks to me that really puts the nail in the coffin as far as this whole old earth versus young earth argument is the days of creation themselves. Because if you look at them from the perspective of someone standing on earth, not necessarily someone observing the earth from the outside, but someone standing on earth, what would he see on day one, or Yom 1, period 1? We'll just call them time periods, or Yom, so that we don't have too much confusion regarding the length. The heavens and the earth were created, right? And the Hebrew text there doesn't necessarily mean what we might assume in English. It is essentially a phrase that refers to the whole entirety of the universe, like all that stuff out there. That stuff was created day one. And we see in Genesis 1, 1 through 3, that it was dark, formless, void. And of course, that's what you would have seen on the earth, because the earth was enshrouded in thick darkness from the very beginning. And then on Yom number 2, we see that the water cycle forms. We see that the waters are separated. And we see text that is essentially an ancient person attempting to describe the water cycle, right? Because some water is up there in the clouds and some water is down on the earth. And there is a separation called sky. And we also see supporting text for that whole water cycle concept in Job 38:9, where the clouds are described as a garment for the early earth, which I think is really cool, because we have to take the Bible as a whole to interpret itself. And the things that are said about creation, other places in the Bible, absolutely have to jive with Genesis. So from that aspect, the Job verse, I think, is relevant. Then Yom number 3, we have continents, we have early plant life. And of course, we know that we are still consistent with the order that's known from scientific discovery. Genesis 1:9, of course, talks about that. And then Yom number 4, we know from the Bible, Genesis 1:14, that someone on earth would finally be able to see the sun, moon, and stars. And the Hebrew text behind all of that doesn't necessarily mean that those things were created at the time, only that they were now able to give light. I think that distinction is really important, because again, we're talking about what would this creation look like from someone standing right there on earth. And what's really cool about our scientific knowledge at this point is that we know that a major oxygenation event happened about 575 million years ago, which is right about the point where Yom number 4 would have been taking place. And Yom number 4 describes the earth as no longer overcast. And of course, that is exactly what happened as the result of that major oxygenation event. And of Yom number 5, we have Genesis 1:21, which coincides perfectly with what we now know as the Cambrian explosion, which is this sudden sea life increase, just out of nowhere, no transitional fossils or anything. Just all of a sudden, the fossil record reflects a whole bunch of sea creatures that didn't exist before. And then, of course, Yom number 6, Genesis 1:25 through 27, we have larger sea creatures, we have land animals, we have humans. And so, of course, all of that squares perfectly.
Yeah, we'll definitely get into some objections regarding that in
Yeah.
later on. But one of my friends actually asked the question, "Are you self-taught in Hebrew?"
I am not a scholar, if that's if that's your question. However, I have read a number of different commentaries with varying opinions. I don't consider myself a Hebrew expert, no, but I've certainly read the writings of several people who are, in fact, Hebrew scholars.
Yeah, I would say a similar thing. I use resources and commentaries from people who know their stuff
Yeah,
to figure that stuff out, because a lot of people aren't able to learn or aren't good at even
right,
languages and things like that. So that's understandable.
right.
So uh, to continue this section of you giving evidence for old Earth creationism and us understanding old Earth creationism, I've seen some disagreement in this camp
Yeah,
regarding evolution. it
Sure.
doesn't seem like there's universal agreement over whether to accept it or reject it or accept some of it. So, uh, what are your thoughts on evolution?
As far as how it squares with the Bible, or why I personally can't accept tenets of it, or what specifically?
If you, as an old Earth creationist, accept evolution or not, and why?
Got it. Okay. So my position on that is essentially macroevolution. We don't have fossil record support for it. We don't have observable support for it. Microevolution, yes, we do have fossil record support for it, and we do have observable evidence for that as well. So, as mentioned, the Cambrian explosion is that's not the only time that fossils have just been found out of nowhere, where a whole bunch of new species just seemed to be there out of no explanation. There are a couple other times where in the fossil record that occurs as well. And Darwin himself asserts that macroevolution is an assumption at best.
Interesting. So, I find that distinction interesting because I've also seen young Earth creationists make that distinction, and they'll say that they support microevolution but not macroevolution.
Mm-hmm.
I think this causes some interesting issues, particularly for a young Earth model of the fall
Yeah.
and a sort of young Earth theocracy, or not theocracy, but theodicy, excuse me, a
Yeah.
way of explaining evil and suffering in the world. But I was curious because as a evolutionary creationist, I'm sitting here like you guys think the Earth is really, really, really old. That's plenty of time for let's just use this as a crude example for wolves to have offspring and them turn into dogs. Let's
Mm-hmm.
say that's a
Yeah.
very like crude example, but you get
Sure.
what I'm saying.
Yeah, because you can take a pair of dogs and in a few generations have a completely different looking dog. Absolutely.
Yeah, so I was kind of like, why not just go all the way and go there. So uh, as related to this, though, a lot of people are going to reject evolution because it means that there needs to be death prior to the fall, and a lot of people are not happy about that. Do you hold to the idea that there is a sort of perfection, animal peace, and absolutely no death prior to the fall of Adam and Eve?
So, because the Bible does not speak on animal death, I can't make assumptions about that. It only says that death for humans was introduced at the time that it was. Animal lifespans up to that point are unknown. However, I think we can infer that there must have been a finite period which animals and plants lived prior to the fall, just because they would have been around so long. And the fossil record seems to reflect that. So, yes, I do believe that there was death to animals and plants before the fall, and that I don't see a problem with that theologically.
Yeah, it is interesting because young Earth creationists will sometimes write articles like, "Did Adam step on an ant?" Because if he did, then he killed it, and that's death. So
Right.
yeah,
And if he pulled up a carrot, he killed it, did he not?
right, right. And so I think the idea that there's absolutely no death at all, I don't think that's even possible, even if Adam and Eve are strictly vegetarians.
Sure.
But uh, even beyond that, we can look at the text itself. We see that God in Genesis 3 kicks them
Mm,
out of the garden. Why? So that they don't stretch their hand to the tree of life
right.
and take from it and live forever.
Right.
So the idea is that that to me that heavily implies that Adam and Eve were created mortal,
Yeah.
which might actually be metaphorically referenced
Mm,
by the fact that Adam comes from dust. So
mhm.
it is at least possible that uh, him coming from dust is not a literal thing, but is a metaphor for the fact that he is mortal. And then in Genesis 3, it uses that. It uses that metaphor. Dust you are, and to dust you shall return. Right?
Hmm.
You are mortal, and you will return from whence you came. Uh,
Sure.
and so, yeah, for me, I don't have a problem with death prior to the fall either. Um, So we have, I think, a decent understanding of old Earth creationism. Are you aware? You've mentioned a couple of church fathers like Augustine, Origen, Tertullian. Uh, as far as the research that I've done, I see that Christians were evolutionary creationists and old Earth creationists before they were young Earth creationists in the modern sense.
Right.
So,
This
what is
young,
your
yeah.
how have you, or I should ask, have you looked into the church history on this, and what are your thoughts on it?
Yeah, so there's been a lot of different views throughout church history. As we both discussed, there are a number of church fathers who we have their writings. We can confirm that they had questions about the length of a day. And there is no one set view as far as young earth, old earth, evolutionary, etc., that was necessarily the church view going through from the early church going into modern times. Christians throughout the history of the church have held a number of different views. And that makes sense because there is a lot of room for question when we read the biblical text. And especially to very early Christians who didn't have the wealth of scientific discoveries that we now have right here at our fingertips, they could look at the text and say, you know what? It says God created it. This seems to be the order, but we really don't know very much more because we're living in, say, the 500s. And modern science has, of course, not progressed to the point where we can discover a whole lot more than that.
Gotcha. I'm curious. You seem to hold to the day age theory of old Earth creationism, but there are other forms of it, and one of them was the gap theory. And I was wondering that there's this sort of like gap at some
Mm.
point in the Genesis account that would allow for a really, really, really long period of time. Would you say that that's the case, or do you think that there's much stronger evidence for a day age view than a gap theory?
So I've heard of the gap theory. It's not something that I personally hold to myself, mainly because I don't see it as necessary. it's it seems to me that all of the times where creation is mentioned in the Bible must agree with each other. Scripture must interpret scripture. And the gap theory has a lot of assumptions that are necessary. Is it possible? Of course. But I just don't see the support in the rest of scripture to necessitate that that has to be the interpretation.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, so this will be the point then where I want to respond, or would want you to respond to some objections that
Sure.
people might have. So, there was, for anyone who doesn't know, I go to a Christian university, and our sophomore theology course used a text called the Moody Handbook of Theology as our textbook. And the author advocates for young earth creationism and argues against atheistic evolution, theistic evolution, and old earth creationism. Now, I personally plan on responding eventually to his sections on evolutionary creationism because I don't think that it is understood or dealt with at its best, you might say. But this is obviously about old Earth creationism, and he takes issue with a couple things there. So, in a section of his book, he says Exodus 20:10 through 11 draws an analogy between a person working 6 days and resting on the seventh, and God creating 6 days and resting on the seventh. The analogy demands 24-hour days. So, why would you, if you, well, of course you disagree with that. Why would you disagree with that?
So I would disagree with that because if you look at the way that the analogy is structured, we would have to make that inference in other places in the Bible as well. And of course, we don't. An example, of course, of that would be the Feast of Tabernacles versus the Israelites wandering for 40 years. Is the Feast of Tabernacles 40 years long? No, it isn't. It's a representation. So it does not have to be exactly second per second, minute per minute, hour per hour. It's a representation, it's an analogy, it's a memorial, and so are many such things in the Bible.
That's interesting. I have not, I've actually haven't come across that argument. Uh, I know that if I were to be an old earth creationist, I would argue that, um, and this is just the case with language in general, but like words have derive their meaning from context.
Yeah.
So if Exodus wants to use days and create this analogy, then that's fine. But we need to look at the way Genesis in particular is using the term. So, like in my biblical Christian thought class, we learned that when we're doing word study, or not biblical Christian thought, excuse me, biblical interpretation class, we learned that when you are doing word studies, you need to look first at the passage itself in the nearest context to define the term. And then if that doesn't help, you can go outside that to the whole book and then the author and then, other places. But you have to understand that words are going to be used differently by different authors. Uh, and then it's tricky with English translations because sometimes English translations will use one word for two or three different Greek or Hebrew words that actually have their own slight nuances. And so
Yes,
you have to
absolutely.
be you have to be careful about
Sure.
that. And
Sure.
so for me, I would say, creating the author of Exodus can certainly create this analogy between the days in Genesis and the work week, but it does not demand a literal 24-hour days for Genesis.
Yeah, it certainly doesn't. And especially if we expand that to the concept of we have Sabbath years and we have Jubilee years. Are we now to say that the length of a Yom is a certain number of years or a year because we have Sabbath cycles that last longer than a literal 7 day week as well? So that analogy goes much farther than just the 7 day week. We can't ignore the Sabbath years and, of course, all of the Jubilee years and all of those things that the Israelites didn't actually follow.
Interesting. Yeah. No, I didn't think about that because you're right. There are other analogies or parallels that Exodus makes between their history or some time period in Genesis and an event that they are supposed to be doing, like Jubilee, even like with Old Testament slavery, they worked 6 years and then were let go on the seventh,
Yes,
right?
exactly.
So even if the text doesn't make it explicit that it's creating an analogy between that and God's creation, like it does for the Sabbath, but it's the same number. It is literally working six and then resting the seventh.
Absolutely. And especially if we continue to look into what the biblical text actually says about the seventh day, especially as an old earth creationist, I would argue that the text very much suggests that it continues because we see that God's rest is defined as creation rest in Hebrews 4:3-4, and that it can still be entered into in, of course, Hebrews 4:1. And we see that quote from Psalm 95:11 there, proving that he's talking about the Israelites. And we also see that God is still working on his Sabbath creation, Yom number 7, in John 5:17. So we see also the evidence of a long slash continued day 7 in that there is no evening and morning verbiage used after day 7. And of course, in scientific observation that no new species seem to have popped up since the time that humanity appeared on the earth.
Gotcha. Gotcha. So another objection that he has another objection to older creationism. He says, furthermore, this theory would mean that there is death before the fall because it involves a long period of time. Genesis, however, indicates that there was no death until Adam sinned. Now, we talked about this a little bit. I don't think
Sure.
Genesis at all indicates that there was no death. I think it indicates implies the opposite. Uh, but
Yeah.
how would you respond to this objection?
Yeah, essentially, like we discussed before, the text, as far as I can see, does not indicate that there was no animal or plant death prior to the fall, only that human death was a consequence of the fall.
Gotcha. So, um, this is this is really interesting. So, you said that you would believe the text of Genesis to be literal. I'm making the distinction between literal and historical again. I think
Sure.
literal is referring to the way the information is conveyed, and then
Mhm.
historical is referring to whether the events happened in time and space. So, like, I. Uh, um, a historical account can be told poetically. I mean, we see that in the Psalms, right? Like
Mhm.
the Exodus and other things are talked about in poetic fashion.
Sure.
So, um, by literal, do you just mean that the stuff here happened, or like as in historical, or do you mean by literal that you don't really see a lot of figures of speech, you might say, that would indicate poetry?
So, first, we see that Genesis literary style is, in fact, historical and not poetic when compared to other ancient works. We would definitely classify that in the historical genre. And we also see that the events that transpire in Genesis have to necessarily be true because we need the account of the scriptures and the account of what we see in nature to line up. And that is necessary because of what Psalm 19 says and suggests that we ought to look up at creation and say, wow, who did that? Got to thank him. The heavens declare the glory of God. So, in my view, those two do have to line up. And they have to line up because the Bible says that they have to line up. So, in that case, Genesis cannot have anything that is false. It is possible for there to be poetic descriptions of things and different ways that things were described, but there cannot be anything factually false in Genesis.
Gotcha. So so for people on the evolutionary creationist side, there are people who want to argue that Genesis 1 through 11 is mythology, and that this is a divinely inspired mythology, and so it is true, not in the historical sense, but in the moral and the theological sense, and so on. And they still view Scripture as inspired, even infallible and inerrant. But they're going to say when it comes to the genre of this text and how we're supposed to read it, we read it as a divinely inspired story in a similar way that if God were to tell a parable, it would be a divinely inspired story. And so, what would your objection to that be? Why does Genesis 1 through 11 need any historicity to it?
Well, for one, it's not a salvation issue. So, to my young earth friends and my theistic evolution friends, I love you again. But of course, I'm going to explain my view as an old earth creationist. So, here, there is no reason that there has to be any difference between what actually happened and what's written in Genesis. And also, again, Psalm 19:1, there should not be a difference. And I don't see that there is. And what's really remarkable about the Bible as a holy book compared to every other religion out there is that the Bible is unique in that it gets the creation account correct in the correct order as known by modern science. When we know that it's written from the perspective of someone standing here on earth and having gone through the days or the yom of creation a little bit ago, we see that if you consider that it's being described to primitive man of, hey, look, this is what would have happened, this is what you would have seen. It was dark, then the water cycle, then the early plant life, then we had an oxygenation event, no longer overcast, Cambrian explosion, bigger sea creatures, land animals, humans, etc. Like all of that stuff is exactly what happened in science. And that just isn't true of any other religious text out there. I think actually that is a profound bit of evidence for the Bible, uh, the veracity of the Bible, especially when compared to other religions and the creation accounts that they present.
Interesting, interesting. So, uh, moving a little bit further ahead in Genesis, do you think that the ages that we find for the patriarchs are the literal amount of years that they lived? So Methuselah would have lived a literal 969 years, I believe his age was.
Oh, they very well could have been, but I don't know that we have anything to suggest definitively that they were or they weren't exactly our modern understanding of a year. I don't discount that they absolutely could have been. Things could have been much different at that time. We didn't have microplastics and a number of other things that we have in the modern day world back then. And I can imagine that the genetic purity was much better back then than it is now, because if you look at, say, the laws of entropy, of course, problems are introduced. Things don't become more organized, they become more disorganized. And so you get a lot of just problems and errors and things that just fuzz that probably weren't there in early humanity. So I can't say definitively because the Bible doesn't say necessarily definitively, but I would certainly not discount the possibility.
Gotcha. Do you think that the flood was global or a regional event?
I don't think the text necessitates that it had to be global. And the reason for that is that it knocked out human civilization. Now, the amount of land that humans occupied at that time, according to the Bible, was not the entire globe. It was a small contained area. Could it have been global? Sure. But I don't think the text necessitates that. And I don't think that I don't think that God is going to do something that isn't necessary. Again, as a software engineer myself, if I can write something to utilize and leverage code that I've already written, I'm going to do that rather than spending a week writing an entirely new feature. And I think God is the same way because God is the ultimate software engineer. He's going to utilize and leverage stuff that he's already got. So if he's got humanity in this little area and he can wipe it out with a flood, I think he's going to do that rather than create extra water that would be necessary to flood the whole earth and then get rid of it somehow.
Interesting. Yeah, I know. I actually plan on I would like to make this video in the future and like do the research and stuff for it. But I uh, don't think that the flood was global either, and I think that there are like mountains of reasons
Yeah,
as to why, even on just like basic moral questions, like uh, the text indicates that the flood was needed because of the violence and the
yeah,
evil of humanity, right? So that means that this is a judgment on
yes.
sin. Okay, if the flood is global, it's no longer a judgment on sin because
It's
now,
overkill.
yeah, because now you have uh, uh, 6 month olds in the womb who are no longer living because
Mm,
of the global flood. They're not committing evil. They're not engaging in violence, uh, and I don't think that they're being penalized for Adam's original sin.
no,
So I the a global flood would, because it that would need to be the case in order for a global flood to be true, that on not only goes against scripture, but I think also goes against the character of God, right? It's, the wages of sin is death, right? The guilty
sure.
the guilty suffer the penalty.
Sure. I do maybe depart from that in just a little bit, in that I do believe that the text tells us that all of humanity, minus Noah and his family, were wiped out by the flood due to this, of course, the rampant sin and everything like that. But we can get into this another time probably. But the phrase that Noah was perfect in his generations, if you go back, and there are different theories on this in Genesis, and this is of course a little bit of a departure, but there is the Sethite theory and there is the Nephilim theory as far
Yeah.
as what it means when the sons of God took wives from the daughters of men. And one view, of course, is that there's a line from Seth and it got corrupted. But another view, of course, which is not necessarily taught in seminaries as commonly, but was certainly held by the early church. And we know this from many of their writings and their references to the book of Enoch and several other books that we don't necessarily consider canonical, is that the Nephilim were, of course, the product of fallen angels creating some sort of offspring with human women. And if that is the case, and there was genealogical corruption within the human race, then perhaps the phrase perfect in his generation, in reference to Noah, is a reference to the fact that this is the only couple of people here that weren't affected by the genetic corruption. So that is a possibility to consider as to why seemingly innocent human beings had to have been wiped out at the time. But going back to the original topic, of course, I do believe that all of humanity, minus those on the boat, were in fact wiped out, because that seems to be what the text implies.
Hmm. So yeah, you want to say that it's all of humanity. It's just that humanity was
Yeah.
kind of small
It,
and
yes.
located in a certain area,
Yeah,
which
it wasn't very far spread at that point.
yeah, which makes sense. And I think a lot of regional proponents have even said that like it's all of humanity insofar as wherever they lived, or it's global insofar as people knew where places were on Earth. Like uh, a a an ancient Israelite is not going to know about Antarctica or the
Right.
penguins on Antarctica, right, or something
Mhm.
like that. So yeah, no, that makes sense. So going back to creation and the earlier chapters of Genesis, um, uh, you mentioned that the days of Genesis do not have to be literal, and they are more day age.
Yeah.
Um, you had also you mentioned that due to this fact, we can say that the Earth is really, really, really old. I'm wondering if you've heard the idea that Genesis 1:1 is actually translated incorrectly. So it should not be translated in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. It should be translated as when God began to create the heavens and the earth, which would which would mean that there isn't a period at the end of that sentence. It's more of a comma and then leads into verses 2 and 3, which says, so it would say that when God began to create the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness upon the face of the deep, and stuff like that. And if that's the case, then Genesis 1 is not even talking about an absolute beginning point of creation. So I was just wondering if you've heard that view and what your thoughts on that, because I think that would support, uh, that would be evidence for the two models that we propose.
So the I don't think that the answer to this is highly relevant, because in other parts of the Bible, we are told that God created what is seen from what is not seen. And we have support for, in other biblical texts, for God creating things out of nothing. And whether or not we agree that Genesis 1:1 says that explicitly, I don't think is as important, because we do have other biblical texts that make that a pretty certain point.
Interesting. Okay. So Uh, I know I did not send these questions to you, but there are other issues in relation
Sure.
to right in relation to faith and science, and one of them is the idea of the flat Earth, right?
Mm,
Like the Bible supports a flat Earth. Now, as a Christian, and even as someone who holds this text to be infallible, I'm going to say that if this is the case, then we can say that God accommodated the understanding of the ancient people in order to teach them moral and theological truth, that he wasn't going to change their scientific understanding before he could change their theological understanding about who he is. And so and then that also might have to do with like the way language works and what is really trying to be said when something is said. Like, as an example, if I walk into a store and I say, "Where's the bathroom?" I'm not asking for the architecture of the building. I'm implying I need to use it for some reason. Uh, and so there is kind of what is said and then what is meant by what is said.
mhm.
And so even if they said, yeah, the earth is flat and there's a dome over it, and God's kind of above all of that. What is meant is that God is the most high, and that's absolutely true. And so there are a couple ways to think about that. But what are your thoughts on that? Do you think the Bible would support, or I guess more specifically, do you think that the ancient authors would have thought that the earth is flat?
No, I don't think so. And if you look again at the nature of the text itself, let's remember that Hebrew is an imprecise language, right? So there is a verse in Isaiah that says he will gather Israel's dispersed people and assemble Judah's scattered people from the four corners of the earth. That's in Isaiah 11, I believe. Isaiah 11:12, in fact. And that is obviously not literal. Even a flat earther will tell you they don't believe that it's shaped like a square, right? So let's get that out of the way. There is some element of imprecision in the language, which absolutely must be taken into account. That we also know that it's not literal because we have that same Hebrew word translated as corners to talk about the four corners of the bottom of a garment, right, in Deuteronomy 22, where we talk about the four corners of your garment and that sort of thing and the regulations for that. And again, nobody that's a flat earther thinks that it's square shaped. And let's see, what other verses do flat earthers come up with?
There's a
They talk
lot.
about,
There's the pillars of the earth.
yes. Oh, here's one.
Mm.
Okay. Isaiah 40:22, about him sitting on the quote unquote circle of the earth. But we have to look at the language again, right? So we have different translations that take it differently. So the KJV says that he sits on the circle of the earth. And then we have others that talk about horizon. Like the Net Bible, for example, it says he's the one who sits on the earth's horizon, and the way that this is translated is not necessarily a literal circle. It is a valid way to translate that word. Don't get me wrong, but it's not necessary that we translate it as a flat circle, right? Because there is some imprecision in that word. So we cannot assume that there's a direct one-to-one translation between the Hebrew word and what the KJV interprets as circle and the Net interprets as horizon. In this same verse, Isaiah 40:22. So we cannot use the implications of one English translation to say, oh, it's definitely a two-dimensional shape, because that isn't what the Hebrew word behind the text implies. And then let's see, there's another one. I did let's see.
There's a lot of different
There
verses.
are.
So it's,
I
they,
was going to say
yeah.
I did a thing on this a while back, so I actually do have a couple of these points. But yes, you caught me by surprise, so I'm like sitting here trying to remember.
No, no, you're good. You're good. Yeah. Um, yeah, I found that even if like some of these verses are at least some of these verses are not supposed to be taken literally,
Hmm.
in my view, it seems.
Yeah.
So I think they have, at the very least, they have less support for their view than they might think they do.
Right.
Uh, but yeah, but
Hmm.
yeah, you do. I mean, you do see a lot of flat earthers. You do see a lot of Christians at flat Earth conventions and things like that, because those also exist too. Um, and this often goes along with other science denying stuff because
Right.
not all the time, but a lot of times it's like a snowball. So
Right.
if you're denying, this isn't necessarily the case. I don't want to argue for a slippery slope fallacy here, but
Sure.
there are a group of people who are going to say, yeah, I'm going to deny evolution. I deny round Earth. I deny vaccines. I deny the even the science surrounding psychology and the social sciences.
Yeah.
Um, so it is interesting to get your view on that because and mine as well because you and I are much more comfortable with science because we see it as revelatory of the creator.
Right. Yeah. And I like how you have your segments called Christians Stop Being Goofy because,
Yeah.
yeah, because that happens so much. And you're like, oh my goodness, please, please stop saying that. You're making the rest of us look terrible.
Yeah. If another person tells me that they're not getting the vaccine because it's the mark of the beast, I'm leaving the Christian faith. No,
Mm.
no, I'm kidding. But yeah, it's you never hear the end of that
Yeah.
of that sort of stuff, especially if you go down the rabbit hole. There's so much. There's so much of it, and it is really sad because there's a whole like natural theology is kind of what we've been pulling from. Like it's a whole branch of theology to see the natural world as revelatory of the Creator, and then
Yeah.
drawing theological, moral, apologetic implications from all of that.
Hmm.
So it
Yeah.
is really unfortunate when they're like, "Nah."
Yeah, definitely. And you have to take the record of what we see from science because again, the Bible tells us to. The Bible tells us to use our brains in First Thessalonians 5:21, I believe it is. And we are to be like the Bereans in Acts 17 and be skeptical. And we are supposed to test things. We are supposed to use the book of scripture and the observations of nature in harmony together. Psalm 19:1. So all of these things together, the Bible must interpret the Bible. And when we do that, I just don't see any other conclusion other than old earth.
Yeah, no, that's totally understandable. So, what is the strongest piece of evidence that you think there is for young Earth creationism?
Ah, young earth creationism. You're asking me to argue against myself. I think, let's see, what calls old earth into question? To me, it just seems so obvious that it's old Earth.
Yeah. No, I'm not gonna act like I disagree there. It does seem pretty obvious. Um, uh, I think maybe one verse that I have not quite been able to get over is when Genesis says that Eve is the mother of all living.
Hmm.
So I don't believe Adam and Eve are the first humans, and I don't think the text supports that anywhere. Um, at least not in the text that's often cited for that. Uh, but so I allow for evolution prior to the existence of Adam and Eve specifically, and the pre-Adamic race, as ancient Christians would call it, um, or I guess early modern Christians would call it.
Sure.
But uh, I'm still not sure well how to interpret that verse. I guess. So in relation to that, then, do you think that Adam and Eve were the first human beings, and would you take that verse in Genesis 2 literally?
Yeah, I would, because of a couple of reasons. one, modern science does absolutely point to there being genetic, quote unquote, Adam and Eve in terms of humanity stemming from essentially one woman and one man. When we look at both the Y chromosomal DNA and the other type as well, we see that going back to a single genetic pair. We also see that if we do not take a literal Adam and Eve perspective, that this has implications for other biblical texts. So I'd be curious as to what your viewpoint would be uh, in terms of, for example, Jesus referring to the first marriage between Adam and Eve as a literal thing. Was there not marriage before that? And also, if there were a human ancestral line, at what point do humans become exceptional? Because the Genesis text seems to suggest that humans are distinct from any other species in that they are exceptional, they are made in the image of God. And so what is the break-off point then between some other hominid creature and what is considered a human creature, e.g., one that is exceptional and in the image of God that the parents of that creature did not have?
Yeah, those are two great questions. I think in relation to the first one, I'm gonna say that Adam and Eve were a married couple, and Jesus is referring back to the created order with Adam and Eve in particular in order to make his point about marriage. But I don't think that his language necessitates a beginning of humanity or even necessarily a beginning of marriage. But I am willing to uh, change my mind on that. And then in relation to your second question, um, yeah, I do think there were humans. There were, on the one hand, humans outside the garden. I think that's implied when Cain seems to be worried about getting killed by someone he doesn't know. And um, uh, so I do think there were humans outside the garden, but I also think there were humans prior to that because of what we find in the evolutionary account. So human, when what we know of ourselves as human beings starts, I think is when the image of God would occur, because the image of God is in reference to the function of this particular creature that God has made. Uh, uh, so it's in reference to their relation to God, their relation to others, and their relation to creation. And all of those three aspects have functional aspects to them, as we see in Genesis 1:26 through 30, where because we're made in the image of God, we have dominion. We're
Mm-hmm.
told to have dominion over and subdue. So we need to be at a point where we can actually do that uh,
Sure.
in the evolutionary chain. So that's my thinking on it as of currently. Uh, I'm still doing research on it. That was actually one of the really unfortunate things about my early Christian faith as a young Earth creationist is that it made me skeptical about science.
Yeah.
So even if like I didn't like science class. I was in 8th grade making a PowerPoint about different types of rocks, and I'm just so irritated with everything
Aw.
because and I was so bummed out because I was like, not only do I not believe that these rocks indicate an old Earth, I don't care about rocks. so so I'm sitting here so like frustrated in class. And then we talked about I think it was uh it might have been ninth grade science class. We talked about um uh maybe it wasn't ninth grade. I don't remember. But in one of the science classes I had, we obviously talked about evolution and periodic table and all that stuff. And again, even there, I was just like, I don't. This is not okay. Let's just push through this.
Aw.
So my appreciation for science like took a hard nosedive
Mm.
Um,
And
and
that's so unfortunate though,
yeah,
because the two absolutely line up, and we do such a disservice to young people, or to people in the church in general, when we make this hard line and say, nah, you have to reject all of these things that are seemingly so obvious that science has shown us that no, we really don't have to reject them. In fact, we shouldn't reject them. That if you have to deny scripture to believe in science, you have a problem. But also, if you have to deny science to believe in scripture, I believe you have a problem as well. Because again, the Bible tells us in Psalm 19:1, it implies that we are to take what is observable and utilize that, leverage that as a reason to believe, and as evidence to support our belief in God, rather than be something that we have to constantly fight up against.
yeah, yeah. So I was often uncomfortable in school because of that. So like a lot of what I learned went in one ear and out the other. So um, so a lot of being a lot of my early stages here of being a evolutionary creationist is really just uncovering the ignorance. Like, I thought at one point, I was like, well, yeah, evolution, it's just a theory. I mean, our theory is just as plausible, not
Yeah.
realizing what a theory actually means according to like what scientific theory actually means. Like, there's a
Yeah.
technical term for that word or a technical definition for that word
Mhm.
in science that um, a lot of younger creationists just don't know because a
Yeah.
lot of them were like me, went in one ear and out the other because that's not what the Bible says, and then they never went back. Um, and I'm starting to do the work of going back,
Mm.
and it is actually helping. I find particularly I I like the philosophy of ethics
Yeah.
and morality and the studies of empathy and things like that. So, what particularly interests me is when I'm studying evolution and like seeing the behavioral patterns of these animals and other things, like the whole 4-year chimpanzee war that
Mm.
took place was like really fascinating to me. There was a study where I forget if they were like apes or monkeys, because I believe that also has a technical distinction. Again, forgive my ignorance, and but they took ape-like uh, animals and they did this experiment with them to figure out uh, whether or not they had some kind of uh, how developed their mental faculties were,
Mm.
and they were able to tell that the apes or the chimpanzees or whatever seem to have uh, empathy and the ability to guess what the individual, like what the human wanted, and then give that to them in the experiment. I'm hazy on the details, so fact check me, but I believe it was a study where they would put this ball somewhere and they would make sure that the chimpanzee knew where the ball was, but the human didn't. And then the human would go looking for the ball. The chimpanzee found it and gave it to them
Mhm.
because it assumed that that's what they wanted. Like, that's crazy. Um, Again, please fact check me and forgive my ignorance. But yeah, that the behaviors was really interesting uh, when a monkey in some tribes comes back from a hunt or something, they'll all scream and shout because it means that they have food that day.
Sure.
Uh, it's really interesting. So yeah, a lot of I'm particularly interested in behavior and then how that even might correlate to our behavior because some evolutionists have wanted to propose that our morality stems from our evolutionary process because we see elephants grieve, right? Like they some animals even have little memorials for the deceased,
Sure.
and there's other things too. So and then obviously that would affect a evolutionary creationist position that also wants to say that God is sort of the grounding for right moral belief, right, and stuff. So, but yeah, so all of that's interesting. But unfortunately, throughout my early years, I didn't really appreciate any of that because I thought that scientists were goofy, basically.
And that's cool because I grew up in a non-religious household, and I thought Christians were pretty goofy when I first encountered them too.
Yeah. Uh, so I guess you could tell us a little bit about your testimony. How did you become an old Earth creationist? Because obviously, all three of these positions, and then particularly old and young Earth creationists, are very much arguing for their respective positions. So, what position did you land on first, and why did you come to what you do now?
Uh, Old Earth, because that's how I became a believer, is essentially seeing. Well, let's rewind a little bit, right? So I was exposed to church a little bit when I was younger because my mom became a Christian, and I thought it was kind of ridiculous at the time. And I'm like, oh, we have to go and like sit and watch this guy talk about stuff and how bad we are. And I hate this, right? I'm an 8-year old, right? And so for a while, I tried to get into it and I just couldn't. I was like, no, this doesn't make sense. And so, of course, even back then, having a mind that was already geared towards one day being an engineer, I'm sitting there asking the pastor questions. He can't answer them. And so I'd go around and ask other people questions. They couldn't answer them. So when people couldn't answer my questions, I very quickly lost respect for these particular Christians and Christianity in general. And I swung the pendulum completely the other way, became a declared atheist for probably a good decade. And I thought it was like this sport to argue with theists, a lot of Christians, but other, religious people as well. And I thought it was super fun to argue with these people and stump them. They're like, "Ha, you can't answer this, you can't answer that," and it's like, this is sad. They can't
Yeah,
answer this. But it wasn't one necessarily one person or one source or one anything really that convinced me. Uh, one day I was sitting in my apartment by myself, just kind of not really doing anything, just thinking, and it just hit me, and I'm like, oh crap, there is a God. What does he want? No. And I just might like something in my brain just put it all together, and maybe that was the Holy Spirit there, like saying, hey, look, you've got this, you've got this, you've heard this, you've heard this, you've heard this. You have to change your position or you're not being intellectually honest
yeah.
anymore. And
Are
that's
you sure
essentially
that
what
happened in a literal 24-hour day, or?
happened. I'm sure that that moment happened in a literal 5 minutes of me sitting on the couch by myself.
Where all great epiphanies happen.
Yeah. I mean, some happen in the bathtub, but no.
Fair enough.
Eureka.
No, yeah, that's really cool. So, we're winding down here. So,
Yeah.
what resources would you offer to someone who is interested in researching creationism and these three perspectives? I know I can will quick say if you want a old Earth creationist perspective, it's obviously you, and then you can look at Dr. Hugh Ross, right?
Mhm.
Of
He's good.
Reasons to Believe. I
Yeah.
think that's the organization.
I believe
He
he's at reasons.org, yes.
Yeah, he's a old Earth creationist, astrophysicist.
Yes,
Um,
he's great. He and his whole team have a lot of really excellent articles over there. And those actually, I'm glad you mentioned that. I had come across a lot of his materials prior to becoming Christian, and a lot of those details that I discovered through reading and listening to some of his materials, in my argument prep against the theists, right? Because I had to argue them down. Um,
yeah.
those were some of the things that stuck in my head. And I'm like, this guy makes sense and he's super smart. And I can't find any holes in his argument. Uh,
Mm.
but yeah, he's good.
Yeah, so I would definitely check him out. I think he's one of the best old earth creationists. If you're looking for, again, this is my view, yeah, and I'll say this and then you can go ahead and tell us what resources you use. But uh, if you want theistic evolution, Biologos is good. They have a lot of articles. They're a ministry that defends the evolutionary creationist perspective, and I found them to be helpful. Inspiring Philosophy as well. He has a lot of great videos, excuse me, on YouTube about this. He's the evolutionary creationist. And then if you want young Earth creationists, not the Creation Museum. No. Uh, Dr. Marcus Ross, I believe. He has a PhD in a scientific field, and I think he's a very well balanced and respectful young Earth creationist. He's not the type that's like, if you're not a young Earth, if you don't hold to this about 100-year-old position in Christianity, you're not saved. Uh,
Right. And
and
that's problematic as well. Whether it's young earth or old earth or theistic evolution, we can't say that it's a salvation issue and that therefore you are not a Christian, etc. if you don't hold to one particular view of creation. That's absolutely false.
yeah, absolutely. Uh, but yeah, so he's very kind, very respectful, and even very well balanced. He'll even disagree with other young Earth creationists. He'll be like, "Guys, I'm sorry, I know a lot about dinosaurs. Leviathan is not one of them." I
Yeah.
believe at least that was Dr. Marcus Ross. He did a video on the What You Pastor Didn't Tell You YouTube channel um, about Leviathan and the Book of Job. Um, So if it's not Dr. Marcus Ross, he's definitely a good resource. And then I will find that other video and make sure to link that in the description as well. So yeah, those resources I think it would be great. Um, there's other more popular people in young Earth creationist circles like Ken Hovind and Ken Ham,
Mhm.
but I actually wouldn't suggest either one of those guys, particularly Kent Hovind because he's uh, not a great person. Uh,
Yeah. I think,
so,
yeah, the
but
what you say and how you say it, both of those are incredibly important.
yeah, yeah, definitely. So we want really nice people who are very smart and can defend their positions with respect. So yeah, those what I would suggest. What would you suggest?
Yeah, I think you covered a lot of them. The Young Earth resource that I'm most familiar with in terms of laying out their arguments and the support for their arguments is Answers in Genesis, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend them per se from the standpoint of um, the kindness aspect. I mean, they, not that they're not kind, but they do seem to hold this "you must believe our view or else" kind of thing.
Yeah,
But in terms of laying out, this is what we believe, and here are some kind of uh, scientific reasons that we can use to support them. I think it is useful as a resource in terms of just that.
yeah. I believe it was Answers in Genesis who made the pretty popular documentary. Is Genesis History?
Mm,
I believe it was them. There's been some interesting responses to that, but yeah, but they're a well known creation ministry as
indeed.
well. So thank you so much for having this conversation with me. There's obviously a lot more we could have talked about.
Sure.
It just in relation to science and faith in general, but particularly within the text, like is Leviathan a dinosaur or something, or other fun stuff. But uh, what to conclude? What would you say to these three positions if you were talking, if we had someone from representative of each side on here, um, what would you say to the three of them?
First, it's not a salvation issue. And as long as you believe that Jesus is who he says that he is and you trust in him for your salvation, that should be our number one concern, right? Not necessarily the specifics of how we ought to understand the text that is described to us in Genesis, right? So, with that out of the way, I think what I would say to everybody is that let's just continue to have respectful discussions surrounding this. I think it's really useful. I would especially say, I would to young earthers, I would say, please don't discount the old earth and theistic evolution views, because that is going to be the only thing that allows some people to come to faith, myself included.
Mhm.
Uh, Knowing that the earth is old, knowing that the universe is old. If you tell me I have to believe in a literal 6-day creation, I'm going to say, well, the Bible can't be true because it's lying, right? And there are a lot of people like me, right,
Oh
from
yeah.
an engineering, science, math, etc. background, who are going to come at it with that exact same viewpoint. So please don't discount the idea of old earth for the sake of people who have that same sort of mental background, right? With that sort of education background, that sort of way of looking at the world. And to the theistic evolution people, I would say, uh, please don't mock the old Earth view, because you perhaps see that it maybe in the view of a theistic evolutionist disagrees with the uh, the modern scientific consensus, right? So please don't discount it on that basis either, because when we look at science, it is not as precise as we think that it is. For example, in 1912, we had the Piltdown Man, which was supposedly that missing link for the human ancestral line. And of course, in 1953, it was proven as a fraud. And in the period between 1912 and 1953, we had several other hominid creatures which were discovered. And each time they discovered one, they said, oh, that's the missing link. Oh, wait, just kidding. It's not. Oh, wait, no, that one's the missing link. Oh, just kidding. That's a side branch. And right, so the science isn't as solid and decided as we might like to think that it is. So to theistic evolutionists, I would say, please don't discount old earth creation on that basis either.
Gotcha. Is there anything that you would have to say to your own side of the creationism discussion?
Yeah, definitely. As far as other people who hold to my exact view of old earth, I would hope that we could consider and be polite to the young earthers, the theistic evolution people, and people who are not yet Christian at all, because this isn't a salvation issue. And let's just keep that in mind, right? That's the number one thing, that how we interpret the text of Genesis is really of secondary or even tertiary importance to salvation.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for that. I know that prior to us going live, I mentioned this, but I have some videos and more of that. These videos will be coming in the future, where I teamed up as a Protestant with an Eastern Orthodox Christian to
Oh,
respond
yeah.
to a Roman Catholic about Protestantism. So it was really cool because we got to have a ecumenical dialogue and, in a way, talk through our disagreements. So it was really nice. So, would you be interested in doing the same thing, except with creationist views? So, uh, evolutionary creationist, and your old Earth would be responding to some video from a young Earth creationist.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd definitely be open to that.
Awesome. Okay. Yeah, I would love to do some more content with you in the future then about that too. Again, sort of foster that intermural and ecumenical dialogue, because I think we need more on that, especially on YouTube. I mean, I remember there wa- there was definitely a time on YouTube, Inspiring Philosophy, who I mentioned to you, or I mentioned before in my recommended. He's talked about this, where like there was a time on YouTube where it was just dominated by like King James onlyists and young Earth creationists,
Yeah.
uh, and we really need to not have that happen. Especially because it might give fuel to, and you're right, it might give fuel to uh, the narrative that some atheists have, and seemingly some Christians have, that there is this necessary conflict between uh, faith, as defined as belief without evidence for a lot of non-believers, and science,
Mhm.
which is all about evidence. So, um, yeah, I think it's really important to foster those conversations. So yeah, we could definitely do something in the future. That said, thank you so much for joining me for this. I really appreciated this discussion, and I would like to also do a similar interview with another evolutionary creationist and a young Earth creationist too. That way, we can continue to foster those dialogues and things like that. So,
Yeah,
yeah,
definitely. Thank you for having me.
yeah, no problem. It was a pleasure. So, thank you guys so much for watching this as well. I will put links down in the description to what the sources that we recommended and her Instagram account, where you can also find a link to her book and stuff, and my link tree where you can find my articles and many other things are also going to be down in the description. And I will also add timestamps to the comment section so that you can navigate your way through this hour and a half long now video. So, thank you so much for watching. I hope this has been helpful to you. I hope this has blessed you. Uh, and I would encourage any non Christians out there to, you can absolutely consider a Christian position that accepts science. And to any of my Christians out there, we can certainly have respectful conversations uh, that where we treat each other like we are truly saved, and that we will be with each other in the end. So, thank you so much for joining me.